Dobro večer, dragi gledalci, dobrodošli u još jednu epizodu emisije Play. Ja sam Pavlom Sturanovicem, a večera sa nama je gospodin Dante Golz, osnivač i izvršni direktor u kompaniji Worldsmith. Večerašnja emisija će biti na engleskom, zato uživajte. Good evening, Mr. Golz, and thank you for... Dobro večer. I want to welcome you to the show and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
As I already said, you are CEO and executive director founder of company Worldsmith. Can you tell us a little more about Worldsmith?
Sure. I mean, those are fancy titles, but in the end, I founded the company about 11 years ago, since we're approaching 25. We worked initially with Valve, so you have your Dota background in the background here. So everything that you see on the arcade back then, we kickstarted that. So it's the first custom game, and then moved on to build infrastructure and worked with Valve to implement those systems, community feedback and such. And so it started from a modding background in a sense, but as you know, modding in UGC, those are the foundational pillars of multi-billion-dollar franchises such as Dota, League of Legends, Teamfight Tactics, Fortnite, PUBG, all of those games. So we certainly found the appeal of working freely without any publisher or venture capital above us who's telling us what to do, and it's a more casual environment. We at that point already had experience. I worked with Ubisoft, and my colleagues as well, Ubisoft, EA, Blizzard. So my first venture, so to say, was 15 years ago now. Blizzard on StarCraft 2. That was also started out as a fan project, and then it was a direct collaboration for Wings of Liberty, and from there on I have been throughout the entire industry. I've done many different things and have worn many hats, and mostly I have focused on my company, of course, with an international group. We worked with EA, Blizzard, NetEase. We worked in terms of, because I know you have an esports background here, we worked on Shanghai DAC 2015. That was at that time the second biggest esports tournament in the world in terms of prize pool. Mm-hmm. And that's one aspect that we do focus on. So we work with different companies as a first-party studio. We worked with Manticore. We worked with Crater, which is a meta company, was a meta company at that time. NetEase had a UGC platform called Cleekly. Right now we have other companies that will be announced in February. So there's this aspect of the front where we really like to experiment without any kind of boundaries. You really get to, here's the resources, try to find something compelling, something that the AAA doesn't do, something that the AA doesn't do, and something that you can just experiment with, without the fear of failure. So that's very convenient. The other more prevalent aspect of our company has definitely more to do with competitive esports games, or in particular one that we're focused on. It is, I used to be a big Dota player. I used to be semi-competitive, used to play in ESL and such. And among other games, I've done top 0.1% of StarCraft 2 and Heroes of the Storm and Heroes of New Earth back then, so a bunch of different games. And I'm very inspired to create something new on that front. We're currently working on an Unreal Engine 5 game that aims to combine old school MOBA elements with IRTS, and at the same time really leverage the engine that is given to us from Unreal 5, whether it's Lumen or whether it's actually a cloud infrastructure, and not for NFTs or anything, don't worry about that, but more about what has technology done for us, for me as a game and level designer, because that's my primary faculty, to create new mechanics that will be interesting and enjoyable. So we're working on that first and foremost, and then in the future, Worldsmith will pivot towards more story, player choice-driven games with narrative, because I'm a big fan of that as well. So, and we, at the same time, I'm a mentor. I've been a speaker across, Synagogue, and been game jams in Tirana recently this year, and mentor for young people. I've worked with various companies here, organizations, whether it's with Philip or Milos, and I really hope to see the scene here thrive. And I know that there's a lot of challenges, certainly, and there's a different culture here, which I do enjoy very much, coming from the West and been here for more than 2 years. So I'm looking to try my best to help the scene and see that a lot of young people have a chance and an opportunity to do something interesting here, because I know a lot of them exist here.
Was that the vision behind establishing your company in Bar? To see the Crna Gora thrive and Balkans thrive in the gaming industry when you established your company in Bar?
Well, it's important to understand it's a legal entity here. The initial, of course, was founded many years ago in the West. Then I relocated to Romania in terms of a legal entity because just various advantages that we've had from that. But here it's a legal entity so that I can operate and that I can be seen as a DOO, of course, have my fancy stamp, can stamp contracts, but also for the legitimacy. And, there's formalities other than that too, for me as well, as a foreigner, of course. So those definitely important elements that are on the formality side and on the passionate side. Yeah, I do love the country, no doubt. And I've lived in 6 different countries, at the very least at half a year to a year, or 21 years in Germany. So, and I've traveled to a lot of countries, and to me, Crna Gora is the best that I know.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, how do you like it here? How do you like Bar specifically?
Yeah, I've looked around in terms of where could I live with my personal preferences. This is a personal preference depending on my, on the things I need. And Bar in particular fulfills that need very well. So we, several employees have established ourselves there. And then the rest of the company is more international. And then, of course, I hope to see and help more local people, Montenegrins, to find a footing here. Really like it. There is pros and cons everywhere. I know that very well. But I think when you move to a certain place, it is more important that you fall in love with the cons, because the pros will always exist. And pros in Crna Gora is very easy. You have, Priroda, Kultura, Tradice, you have obviously, the sea, and you have the national park, and you can be in Kolashin, you can go and have, go for a ski ride or something, and then you can be at the beach by the evening. It's very beautiful, of course, and the people are very hospitable. Most people, the vast majority of people that I interacted with in Montenegro, they have been treating me pretty well. Bad apples always exist, but they don't represent the country, I think. And I think the important part really is to understand and accept and tolerate the cons here. And I understand Montenegrins will be looking at it and thinking, like, why would he give up a life in the first world and come here? Well, you don't know what you have until it's gone, let's say. And it's all comparative, of course. It's all relative. For me, for my personal lifestyle and what I expect and what I want, peace is a pretty good argument, for example. Bar and Montenegro as a whole is a pretty solid choice.
Do you see yourself in foreseeable future being here in Montenegro?
Well, I've been here for 2.5 years, so as long as the country will have me, I'll stay here, of course.
Of course. I want to ask you, and we talked about before the show a lot about that. How did you start? How did you get into the video game industry, and what motivated you to pursue the field of video games?
It's a tough question. I mean, it depends. It's usually the usual generic story of, I played games when I was young, and therefore, wow. And everyone has that story. People who've worked with Blizzard, any spokesperson will tell you a very similar story. For me, I think I can pinpoint the exact moment, at least. So that's very useful. But I started playing games from 1995. That was back then in Kazakhstan. So I had a Sega and what we call Dendy. Even though it was just a SNES, really. It was a SNES, and so a lot of console gaming. And then we moved to Ukraine back then, and then in 1997 I got my first PC, computer PC, like family PC, that is. And then you would have the usuals, Doom 1, Diablo 1, StarCraft, Warcraft
2D games.
1. Yes, of course. And at some point you moved the way to 3D, but most of the time, yes, those were the games that I grew up with. And it was only later that I really found out there was, specifically back then, I was a big fan of Valve, the corporation. Of course, then worked with them later in 2014, as you can see in the background here. And there was they had Half-Life 2, Portal and such, but they specifically had a mode where you could play the game with developer commentary in mind. So the world would freeze. They would probably put host timescale to 0. The world would freeze, and you could run around, and they would show you something, how they made the game, how they developed. They showed like Lost Coast. They showed you HDR back then. That was revolutionary at that time. They showed their wireframes, and you would see behind the curtain.
I'm sorry, that was in 1997?
No. That was when Half-Life 2 was already out for a year or two.
Okay.
Right, and I played that, and I played it with the developer commentaries, and those Gabe Newell, that's where the Gaben meme comes from and such. And they really allowed you to look beyond the veil and really understand like the matrix, so to say. See the code to some degree. And for a casual gamer back then, I didn't really think too much about how games are being made. Right, and that one inspired me a lot. And I remember it was specifically the moment you come from the train station, you go through the entire pavilion, the field, the cafeteria, so to say, and then you open the doors, that there's a very impressive moment of cinematography. The music kicks in from Caleb Bailey. He was an excellent composer, really just god-tier type of work at that point. And that was really the moment where I thought, hey, I want to make something like this. And that set me on a very long journey back then. Back then it was very different. You couldn't go on YouTube and you would have a bunch of Indian people describe to you how to make the specific thing. Back then we had Yo-Yo Game Maker and such, and it wasn't like Unity and Unreal were widespread, right? It was like, yeah, Unity existed, Unreal 2 or 3 existed, 3 not yet at that point, if I remember correctly. But you had very limited resources, and it was a lot of trial and error. It was a lot of, it's not like the computation was amazing either. These companies, we were all trying to figure out what the hell is going on. What is this game thing? Because if you look at the game industry as a whole, every 5 years I can explain to you how the game industry has changed, because it does all the time. And you can't live in this industry not adapting, let's say. And that's why it was a different time, let's say. I'm glad that it's a lot easier these days to get into game development, because back then it was tough. And back then it was also, like getting a job was also a very, very different beast than today, let's say. The market looked very differently, of course.
How did you get into the game development since there's no YouTube tutorials, guides? There were books, I presume?
There were some guides, there was some YouTube videos, of course, but it was nowhere as widespread. YouTube didn't have that algorithm yet. YouTube didn't have that strong sense of monetization. YouTube didn't have the whole, clickbait, I'm going to shout into the camera with this thumbnail, you're doing these 5 things wrong or something like that, right? We didn't have any of that. So it was really just passionate people wanting to share knowledge. That's it. Yes, maybe some of them had some narcissistic tendencies and megalomaniacs who really wanted the attention. Of course, they wanted the fame. But a lot of people, they really just wanted to help. And those people still exist today. But it is really true that the algorithms these days were on all kinds of social media, which is on no social media these days, why it is really distorting the motivation and what exactly goes behind the process of trying to spread knowledge, right? And what knowledge you don't want to spread at all, for example.
I'm sorry for interrupting. You said the people just want to help. And does that community changes right now? Do people like to help now, or they just...
Oh, certainly. There are more people, for one. So the percentages might have changed because there's a different generation, certainly. I mean, when I grew up, I started game development, if I would call it like that, Warcraft 3 maps that I published some. They were decently popular in my small circle, but it wasn't anything special. It was just really for me to understand how do triggers work, how do bounding boxes work, what does that mean, how do you script something, back then it was with Jazz, I believe, if I remember correctly. Later it would be Galaxy script in StarCraft 2, so it would all be like somewhat similar to Python, somewhat similar to Lua. Of course, Lua became the golden standard in the game industry, obviously, but the people existed. It was just the field was different and the generation was different, right? Those people ended up, people who were nobodies then ended up like Ben Brode, for example, at Blizzard, right? He was just a pizza delivery guy, so goes the story, right? Never got to ask him that myself personally, but those stories definitely exist, whether his story or not is exactly true, or maybe it's a little bit of a PR stunt, which do happen, of course. There are stories that are being embellished. The importance is that these people do exist. I also started from just like the way I got in touch with Blizzard is because I made something, and they noticed you. They noticed. right? And then Capesiulus back then from the EU Blizzard team, shout out to him if he's still if he's still in the industry, because people do burn out sometimes as well, and they just leave the industry forever. Like for example, when we worked on Warcraft Reforged, you know, Pete Stillwell just one day. I mean, there's a lot of dirty domestic policies and games that happen, and at some point people just can't take it and they leave, especially when they're being thrown under the bus by the suits. That's why I always say, you know, a lot of kids and teenagers and, you know, even more adolescent people, they really think that working in AAA these days is so amazing, but it really isn't. It's much better to be as indie as you can, even if that entails venture capital. It's still much better than be under EA or be under Blizzard these days, because, well, Activision rather, you know, because when I worked on StarCraft 2 and the very beginning of my career, and then once again I worked with my company on Reforged, you know, on the flagship for the UGC. Those were two different companies. You know, you couldn't even recognize it. It's like a different person embodies the entire spirit of that which comprises the entire ethic and morals and goals of what Blizzard used to be. From Mike Morhaime, you know, we had a chat with Mike, and he's a really down-to-earth guy. He really cared. He really had this passion. Then with Bobby Kotick, you know, shooing him out of the way and backstabbing him, you know, with Vivendi and everything back then, the company changed. And it will never be the same again. It's really difficult for some people to accept, but it's not the same Blizzard anymore, right? And that's why working in AAA, for example, I worked at Deep Silver. There was a time I was at that point, I was like 7 years in game development, give or take, and then I wanted to see the other side, see if the publishers are as bad as they are. Spoiler, they are, right? And I've seen those stories where, well, you have suits, people who've never even touched a game, they see, oh, there's a bunch of nerds who give me money, let me make something, I guess, and these people will make it for me, I will publish it, take all the money. Maybe the developers get, it's business, right? It's just business, and I'm not here for the business. I actually don't like the business aspect of, well, don't like is a strong word, let's say. I do know it's a necessity, but my passion is not for the business. I can do it. I have done it so, demonstrably so, clearly. Getting one deal to another, right? You know, working with venture capitalists. You know, I've done a bunch of consulting with them. You know, telling them, hey, don't invest in this; it's gonna fail. And then 3 years later, it does fail, right? So, but you know, that's a whole different kind of forms. But it is really a whole different level when you are as indie as you can compared to when you work under several layers of bureaucracy that just can't get to share any consensus whatsoever in order what the hell we want, what the hell the shareholders want, and what the gamers want, of course. So those are very different aspects. And when you're so up and close to that, there's some stereotypes that are true. Some stereotypes that are overblown because gamers don't really understand what it's like. So they just assume because it's a meme and it's funny, and so you want to believe it. But sometimes it's a bit more nuanced than that. You know, no one talks about it because there's no point in talking about it because, you know, game developers are busy developing games rather than sitting on podcasts and talking about it because they know that there's not much use out of it, let's say.
Exposure, not much of it.
Yeah, no, certainly, but that's for people who want to push their own career, right? That's a different story.
Do you think that games now are developed for the business or for the players?
I mean, it depends on the business and the players.
In general, I mean, in general, the nowadays
statistics will tell for the business. Yes, certainly. There's more, especially the last 10 years have really shown that. Let me put it another way. When I was 14, 15, right, and games were still somewhat niche, you would say you're a gamer, it's like, oh, you just sit in your basement or what, and play all day, or if you even would say you're a game developer, people wouldn't believe you, right? They didn't even think about the concept of someone actually making those games, right? As neither did I at some point in my life when I was a child. But I always wished that, oh, I hope one day we'll be mainstream, you know, I hope one day we'll get something like the Game Awards, and hope one day we'll have the big money and we will be recognized, and here we are. Sometimes, you know, be careful what you wish for. If you pray for rain, you got to deal with the mud too. And that's exactly where we are right now. We really are in the midst of it, and it is a lot of passion is just getting destroyed. And for me, it is tough. You know, I have favorite IPs. You know, we really liked like Mass Effect, the original trilogy. And then Andromeda comes out, and that's a bit of a disaster. And then, Dragon Age Veilguard comes out recently. That's a complete disaster, right? And you realize what really has happened with this kind of attitude and what business has led them to. Politics, of course, as well. That's a strong part of it, of course. But at the same time, there are big successes. There's Larian Studios, and whether you like them or not, clearly, they've been a great success, and they are fairly indie. Yeah, you can say it depends on how you define indie, but they don't have like a major publisher above them telling them what to do. Sven is pretty casual. He comes up with a shirt, he doesn't care, and he calls out the game industry as it is. And that's really like on the Game Awards just recently, right? He was calling out the game industry as he did before, right? He was saying that you guys are stupid because, well, they are. And even if you want to just say, oh, I want short-term gains, even then it's a bad idea to do what they're doing, right? And at the same time, you have someone like very recently, 10 days ago, Grinding Gear Games came out with Path of Exile 2. I've been really enjoying the game so far, and it's one of the few rare moments where I'm looking forward to a game this season. That's sad because there's a lot of IPs that I used to love that are now basically dead or ruined. I would just rather they would have, well, be rest in peace, let's say.
Your passion for PoE, Path of Exile 2, is it something like World of Warcraft when it first got out?
No, because it can't be. It is unreasonable to set yourself up for such failure because I'm much older now. It is much more difficult to be hyped for something. And when World of Warcraft came out, I wasn't anywhere close to game development, really. And when you're not a game developer, you see the world in a more magical way, I suppose, especially with a child like I. You don't really understand what's possible and what's not, and what's a big illusion, right? There's a big dissonance and there's a big disconnect. Like if once you are really a game developer who's really deep into it, you can't stop look at it from a different perspective. You have to stop sometimes and ask yourself, how did they do that technically? How do they clean up all those polygons that are, here in the garbage collection, let's say, or such, right? So it's really same. For example, we have a composer from Scotland. He's a rather very, very passionate guy. And he can't just casually listen to anything anymore. He always has to overanalyze. He always has to, like, I'm a very big enthusiast, and I've done audio work myself, and I worked with composers in the past across the AAA sphere, some really interesting names. But I sent him like an audio clip of some score that I really like, some game OST, and he can't stop analyzing it. And I'm thinking, no, just enjoy the music, right?
You cannot listen to it for the pleasure.
Yeah, it's difficult for him, let's say. And I understand that because this is the same for our art director here, same story. Like, she looks at it and it's also not that... There's always some flaws she will notice that the average gamer will not. And I don't know if you can turn that off at that point, right? So it's the same thing. It's like, I wouldn't want to work on a game that I'm looking forward to because I wouldn't be able to enjoy it anymore. Not to the same degree, let's say, right? There are some games, of course, that have infinite replayability, like longevity, like Dota, right? Or StarCraft, those people, Dustin Browder, David Kim back then. David Kim made his own venture capital company now with that new entry that he has recently. And they can work on it, and then they can still enjoy it after work. That's the ideal case scenario. But if you're going to work on God of War or something, or Last of Us, if you like that game, then you can't really enjoy it because you know every single nook and cranny, right? So there's a certain curse combined to it too, and that's why I definitely right now like to work on games with replayability and multiplayer, because you can really enjoy it as well and enjoy it with the community. You can be in those lobbies. For me, it's an amazing feeling when, for example, I co-worked on the Assassin's Creed franchise as well, and then when I go to like a GameStop and they have a life-size statue of Kenway, right? It's a cool feeling. When I go to Gamescom and I meet 6-7 people who are all dressed like assassins of all kinds, it's a really cool feeling. You can't replicate that. I can't possibly explain how it feels because you really have to live it. When you have a tournament of a game, even if it's a small tournament, let's say $10,000. Well, these days that's small. Back then it was huge, of course. And you see like a small hall of 300, 400 people played the game you worked on. That's not a feeling I can explain to you in words. You really have to just live it, you know.
And how was the feeling you worked on with the Perfect World in the International 9 for Dota 2?
No. That was DSC 2015.
2015,
Yes.
the Shanghai Major.
Shanghai
Major.
Great. That was back then the second biggest esports tournament.
Yes. So that was the major, then the TI. So it was pretty big.
It was huge back then.
How was the feeling? How was the feeling working with second biggest tournament in the industry?
Well, in the history back then, yeah. Well, by prize pool, yes. Well, I mean,
I think it was $1 million or $2 million.
3 million actually.
3 million.
If I remember correctly, that was 3 million with the compendium. They had a compendium, and we worked on the compendium part, and we did the show match where we had Dandy and Funnick was there, if I remember correctly, a few Chinese personalities, one member from the audience, casters. So it was a fun match, and we had 1.1 million concurrent viewers. Of course, China helps a lot. Obviously,
yes.
It was less in the West, but the Chinese, they were really out for it. And I mean, I don't know. I can't. I mean, it's been a long time, but it was definitely a feeling of affirmation in the sense of like, yeah, I made the right choices to pursue this career, and it's like I want to keep doing this for sure, because this passion that brings people together. I know several couples in real life that met over a game, sometimes esports or like ESL Frankfurt. There was a couple, and they're married now, right? They met over that game and they're married, and that's it. So it's a big deal. In fact, if you watch the BlizzCons, there's like there used to be every single year there would be some proposal.
Yes.
Yeah, you know that one.
Yes.
Yeah. So. It was.
And every year there's a red shirt guy.
Yeah, of course.
They even made him an NPC.
I saw. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about compendium. You mentioned compendium.
Yeah.
There is no compendium now.
Yes.
And there, in our eyes, not the business guys, the players, in the eyes of the players, that's not a really good business move, because there's no compendium. There's no people paying for the compendium. There's no hype about it. The lower prize pools for the internationals.
It's not just that. They also gave the reins of the international production to, what was it, PGL?
Yes.
If I remember correctly. So they're not even in charge of the international production anymore, and you can see it because the last TI was underwhelming, let's say. And I know this was a common consensus that was shared. There was definitely, the prize pool is definitely a big factor, because
it dropped from like 40 million to...
Yeah. It went up year after year. Because I was at the very first... Now, I don't have that shirt now because it's almost dead, but I have several shirts from the first international with Lena that became an avatar later, the Arcana. I was there with my father in Cologne in 2011 when they first showed Dota. Because I had already access before. I was in the early alpha of Dota.
You mean the international one when Navi won?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. That's where I met Daniel and Pape for the first time, because we knew each other for a while. Then we played together as well, sometimes pubs and such. So playing with Andy is always like, just because you play with Andy doesn't mean you're gonna win. Trust me. Like, he's gonna troll all the damn time, and then he's gonna lose the game.
I think you kind of feel good even if he trolls.
Yeah,
he's kind of a person.
He's a very positive person. He used to be the poster child for Dota as a whole, for sure. He was in the free-to-play, the documentary, of course.
I think he was the right guy.
Yes. Yeah, he was great. It was great. It was very emotional stuff. A little bit fluffed up, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But it resonates with the players.
Needs to be.
It's a nice, story to tearjerk a little bit.
Even with Fear, of course.
Fear, same story. Yeah, there were some aspects of the documentary that weren't quite as the reality shows, let's say.
Yes, but they need to pump it up a little bit.
Yeah, and the Valve knows that. Valve is they are a very effective company, but they're also a very ruthless company. There's people who will tell you about that, because we see Valve as this like Gaben Lord and Savior company who's just like he's God and he's the best, and it's like, yes, they've done some good, but there are some very brutal practices going on. If you listen to, I used to be a huge fan. I used to listen to every Gaben interview, whether it was the BAFTA Awards, the keynote, or whether it was the LBJ in the university, and just really trying to learn as much as I could from him, because he's an interesting individual, but he's also very ruthless. And you can see that just the stories they get devoured, they get kind of memory hold. But like if you listen to what Jerry Ellsworth has to say, or Rich Geldreich, or Derek Genrich, all of these people that used to work with Valve, the stories they tell, it's a nightmare. It's like, there used to be a very famous, the most famous, like, she was the queen of the workshop. A lot of the sets, Anuxi was her name, or is her name. She also said, Valve is nice and all, and they made me a millionaire, but because of the hats that she was selling, she was one of the first one next to Vidotto and Robosici and all of these people. That a lot of the sets that you see now, they made a lot of them, right? And but she would say I would still never work for them because it's a nightmare inside, and it's like a high school clique, and they do some really ruthless things. And Valve was the very first company to, in the game industry, to actually specifically hire psychologists. They specifically hired psychologists in that field to really do as much manipulation as possible, both on the inside and, of course, on the gamers. Yanis Varoufakis, he was also the Greek, if I remember, prime minister, finance prime minister, right? And they hired him for a while as well. And it is funny, we give so much crap to EA and Ubisoft for the loot boxes, but it was actually Valve who started all of that. Right, with Spoils of War and Counter-Strike before that, right? It's very interesting, and they developed that on the most psychological foundation based on casinos and gambling machines and such, right? And the mobile game industry has learned a lot from that as well. So, we say that, but Counter-Strike is also a casino game, and we kind of forget about that. And we say, Lord Gaben, give me 90% sales. It's like, yeah, it's not Gaben who's doing that, though. That's not how it works. But that's a different story. It's just the perception can sometimes really twist a lot of reality in terms of how we see the game industry and how indie developers feel, for example, about Steam, how there's a 2-tier class system as well on Steam, and then it's a very complicated business. Let's say it is really complicated. Same as game development itself. There was I remember one of the examples I used to give was John Carmack, right? He is as id Software and such, and he obviously worked with NASA. He worked with Musk. SpaceX, and but at the same time, and Oculus, of course. And he said on the Joe Rogan podcast back then, he said something like, because there's the term, it's not rocket science. But then he says, because he is a rocket scientist, he has the authority to speak. While at the same time, doing game development, says, basic propulsion, low gravity environments is less complex than a AAA game. It's like game development is harder than rocket science itself. That's his quote. You can look it up. So if he says that, and I can't say because I'm not a rocket scientist, but I can say that it becomes really complex because there's so many layers to it, and sometimes some game will succeed, you don't know why. You can't tell, not really. There's theories and speculations, and everyone wants to be an armchair expert. But if it really comes down to it, to objectively prove it, there's no such thing, right? And the opposite is also true. There's some game that you think should have succeeded, doesn't, right? It just doesn't get the traction. Unreal Tournament 3 was one of those, right? There's lots of games that you can say, wrong place, wrong time. There was no memeability, let's say, because some games literally become a meme, and then word of mouth marketing propagates them throughout the entire industry, and that's how it works. But it is a very complicated business, and it changes all the time. All the time.
I want to interrupt you for a second. Sure. We're gonna go on a quick commercial break. Then we
go ahead.
Right back in. Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. We are back in the studio. Mr. Holz, can you tell me what technologies do you consider the most important of making the video game in the development? For example, AI, VR, and blockchain, etc., etc. What is the most important, or is it necessary in that case to have all these technologies to make a video game?
It's a broad question. You mean probably future prospects? Is that what you mean? Or you talk about today's climate, right? Well, I mean, if you say blockchain, that has obviously not worked very well. I had venture capitalists back then who jumped on the Web3 and NFT craze, and from the get-go, I'm not Nostradamus or anything. I'm not trying to be, but it is demonstrably true. Can be proven by my statements back then that I told them and consulted them. It's like, that's not going to work. Ubisoft was the first one with Quartz, and Ghost Recon, my best friend works there. and at Ubisoft still, because I used to work with them long ago when they were a different company. But they tried that, and there was zero interest. It's like gamers don't want NFTs and web tokens. Like no normal person wants that, right? I had myself a run-in with John Oswald, who is the previous founder of Zynga, and he made a company, well, with a bunch of founders called Gala. And Gala back then in 21, they really wanted to jump on the NFT train, and they did. And they, hired a lot of companies. They offered us a lot of money, the biggest pool of money I've ever been offered to a company. But the prerequisite was, or the condition was, that it should have been NFTs. So I wanted to make the MOBA, and they said, okay, well, it has to be NFTs, right? It has to be with that, and each hero is an NFT. So imagine in Dota, you bought Crystal Maiden for only, and say that in quotation marks, $500, but I bought an anti-mage for $20,000. So you can do nothing to me. I teleport to you, one hit, you're dead, right? From the game, from very beginning of the game, rather, right?
So it's pay to win.
No, I think pay to win is an understatement in this case, right? This is a massive understatement. We are really literally talking about pay to obliterate. Like, the damage DPS, even with full uptime, on that hero with NFT, with a high NFT legendary, they call it, is lower from a low tier character than the regen rate of that character, meaning you cannot actually deal damage at all. There is no balancing, and my primary faculty is game design, level design, but I also do systems design and balancing, because I really love the balancing aspect, because it's a very complex process which you will never truly get right. Let's say there's no company, even back then, StarCraft 1 of the most balanced games in the world, right, in terms of esports, definitely by consensus, by statistics. Even they did a really phenomenal job, and it was much simpler back then. They had a lot of time to do so, but balancing these days is you'll never get it right. It's impossible, right? So blockchain, I think we can just strike that out of the equation. I don't see any current use. The optics are really bad. There's no appetite anymore. There's no interest. Justin Bieber buys some NFT for, don't quote me on that, but several $1 million or $1.2 million. I think he bought one of those apes, and it's now worth basically nothing, right? And it's like all of that
kind
hype.
Of a scam.
Sorry?
It's a kind of a scam.
Oh, yeah,
sometimes?
Definitely is a scam. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a very harsh word to use. I understand that, and a lot of people will not be happy with it. But especially, if you talk with venture capitalists or something, they will tell you about, it's the metaverse and it's this, and then you ask them, okay, what is the literal definition of that, right? How do you define that? What does that really mean? We had metaverses in Second Life 25 years ago, almost, like 20 years ago, right? So what does that really mean? What are you offering what doesn't already exist? What is your USP, your unique selling proposition, right? So that was... I don't see a future in any time soon. It's not like I'm against blockchain. I am a crypto enthusiast. Crypto has treated me really well over the last 4 years, so I can't complain. And I do like it, not just for the financials, but I do like it for the principles, for the freedom, for anonymity if you need be, if you really need it. Let's say if you're a journalist or something. I mean, I understand there are some negative connotations with it too, or you're buying some illegal things and such. And I get that, but you can do that without it as well. The crime syndicates have worked just fine before crypto was ever a thing. Let's say. I understand the arguments and the nuance of it, and we can discuss it forever, but that is not really the point. In terms of AI, that is quite tiresome, really. It's like every single interview, every single speaking opportunity I was on recently, every single time it's a conversation. Everyone discusses AI, and GDC is full of it, and all the podcasts talk about AI, and not just in gaming. So there's definitely...
Is it a new future in gaming? In gaming, game development?
Yes, certainly to some degree. But first I can preface it by saying that there are multiple attempts. Square Enix would be one, for example, when they tried to make a very AI-generated game that was a complete failure, and other public attempts. And there are some private attempts. I know of divisions within large companies, AAA companies, to try to outsource almost everything to AI. They really tried. And not going to name some names here, but definitely publishers and companies you most definitely know. Because everyone does R&D, right? Research and development. And they I mean, the shareholders would love if you could just fire 80% of the people, 90% of the people, and the rest who remain are so-called prompt engineers or whatever the title they give them. I mean, of course, ludicrous, but nonetheless, they would love to do it. They would love to outsource everyone. They get all the money. The AI will do everything, but gamers are not really buying it. Mobile games, maybe, yeah. In China, I do know because, if I were to play the devil's advocate and steelman that argument, certainly I do know of 80% of 2D artists have been fired in different divisions of Tencent, for example. Yes, those companies exist, although that headline was actually kind of misconstrued because it wasn't just because of AI, but it's definitely part of it. But that is because the culture and the laws around it are very different in China, right? The quality bar is lower from both gamers and company. And at the same time, they don't really care about copyright or things like that. So it's not really a thing in there. And I know really well because we did work. We had our run-ins with Chinese people, and even though back then when I worked with Perfect World, it was a really good and, let's say, it was a very pleasant experience. The people that I worked with, very polite, trying very hard. So that was
Perfect World is a Chinese company.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
exactly.
And now?
It's been disbanded and merged, and a lot of people have been. But that was a while ago, right? They do exist in some legal capacity still, but there's no real presence, if I remember correctly.
Like it was
back then. Oh, definitely not. Yeah, definitely not. These days we have NetEase and Tencent. Those are the two major players. And I know there are other. But even if you look at something like Black Myth Wukong, right? I can assure you that the involvement of AI generation that ended up in the real game is practically negligible, let's say. It's practically non-existent.
Really good game.
Yeah, it's a very good game. It is not my cup of tea, but I really respect it nonetheless. And I can not like a game. It can be not my genre, but I can respect what they're doing, and I do respect what they've done. They were one of the first people to really utilize Unreal Engine 5. Now, whether they've really peaked it or not, that's a different conversation, of course, and it's an impossible task, really. But they were one of the first to make people get a certain hype for Unreal 5 back then, when it was still muddy waters, when everyone would remain on Unreal 4.2 or 2.7 or whichever version we had back then. So including us, right? We also made our mobile. We wanted to migrate to 5, and at some point we started that effort. But there's a lot of the unknown. There was a lot of It's very buggy because I do like Epic Games a lot, and I do like what they're doing with Unreal. In my opinion, I mean, I've worked with a bunch of engines, proprietary engines, even Frostbite and Anvil and Snowdrop and whatever, but and some proprietary engines that have basically no name. But in terms of public, Unreal Engine does an excellent job. At the same time, they do like to embellish. They do like to put on a show for investors. I remember when Monte Games happened last year, and there were speakers and they were praising it like it was the second coming of Jesus. But in the end, it's like, no, that's because you don't really deeply work with it. You work with it on the surface, I understand, but actually, if you worked on it to its detail, you would understand that there are still a lot of problems to iron out, but there are, and clearly some games on Unreal 5 run pretty well. So there's a good future. So if you're asking me what technologies, well, it would be the engines, certainly. There's definitely in terms of AI, I mean, we can talk about it for a very long time, trust me, we don't have the time for that. But let me just say one important thing, I suppose. I really wish that AI, instead of trying to do this whole creative outsourcing, which it can't, like ChatGPT, Gemini, none of them are creative. None of them. I've seen benchmarks of people trying to get them to create something that is actually creative. It's impossible. Of course, it's impossible. It is an LLM after all. It is not an AGI. It is not some amazing, synthetic brain. It is not. It is simply like the way that 2D image generation, like Midjourney, DALL-E, it is pretty simple actually. If you look into the research papers and if you look in how it works, it's not a complicated thing, really. And that's why there were so many branch offs, because it's fairly easy, let's say. Perfecting it is a whole different story, and we still haven't, because these days, you can almost instantly tell that something has been AI generated, like an image. Like
yes.
The Midjourney has the very specific style, and they're trying, but it's still obvious. Like our art directress, she would be able to instantly recognize, this is clearly AI generated. Sometimes I ask her when I'm not quite sure. She's like, yeah, look at this, and it's like, and of course there's forensics as well. Forensics on the other side, where we really work on methods to detect if something hasn't been AI generated or not. So you can do overpaints, of course, and all of that. But my point is rather, what I wish AI, and I do think what AI will do in terms of game development to really improve the pipeline, will be the tedious work, the tedious technical work, such as UV, ID maps, and a good topology in the 3D sector. When you really are working on a model, sculpting and everything, you need to make sure that all of that is, let's say, in simple terms, tidy. So all proper topology. They can't do that yet. They really can't. We tried. Other companies have tried. They're really very far behind that. Yeah, there are some attempts, and I do very much believe, I'm fairly certain to make that call, that if a company, venture capital backed or otherwise, figures out how to really ease that process and make it a reliable way to take off that tedious, annoying work from the artists so that they can actually focus on the creative, they will become a unicorn company for sure, like $1 billion company, right? So that is one of those cases where it can really do a lot. The same thing with machine learning and neural networks in terms of visuals, where we can, in simple terms, like overlay a filter on top of a face to make it actually photorealistic if we want it, let's say, right? Depending on the factor and depending on the scale that we are pursuing. That is something that is certainly going to be very important, because to this day, even the best companies, they still have troubles with making specific things look actually photorealistic. We don't have the technology yet. Even the pre-rendered stuff. You know, I've watched Witcher 4, the trailer recently. It's like, you can see the flaws, certainly. You can see that it could have been better, but they can't make it. You know, Phantom Liberty, that trailer was excellent, right? But still, despite that budget, despite all of that, there are still issues, and I know that over time we will overcome that fidelity. That uncanny valley is obviously a big problem, right? And over time, I do think that AI could help us with that, but it really depends on how we implement it and how we work with it. Like the good thing about the neural networks right now in terms of machine learning as such is that it's open source, right? Stable diffusion, for example, open source, right? It's not like a subscription-based something that gives you exactly that. Stable diffusion allows you to do a lot more, and control net is an additional layer to it. And that's something that, you know, these corporations haven't done. So that it really depends. It's a very, very vast topic, but I do think, last but not least, it is rather overblown. And it has been overblown with venture capitalists as well, you know, all the investors. And of course, it's not their money. It's money from BlackRock and Sequoia and Vanguard. Obviously, they just manage the money. They don't really care too much if they lose it or not. And it's like the meme goes, like, how can I sell you this glass? Well, AI powered. There you go. Right? It is actually rather baffling how many projects have been funded with $100, $200 million. Some I can name, where you look at it, the substance, and you're like, you don't have the expertise, the acumen, you don't have the people to make it work, to make what you pitched. It is not possible right now, or you can't do it, let's say. Maybe someone can do it. Maybe the greatest minds could come together, whether, you know, it's John Carmack, or, you know, whether it's Musk, if in his rather the best, it's not just Musk, of course, but, you know, the best engineers that he can select and finance. Maybe they can do it over time, but what we're promising the venture capitalists, that is obviously not going to happen. And then these companies go up in flames, and it really, I wouldn't say it upsets me, but it does bother me a little bit just to see just how much resources, manpower, and time just gets wasted on prospects and ventures where you can, from the very get-go, say this is nothing. This is almost a scam. No, I know there's some money laundering going on there in the industry, of course. You know, it's the same. You know, when you talk about such big sums, obviously these things are going to happen, but nonetheless, it is rather difficult to look at it and say, you know, there are lots of indie companies that deserve this more, and you give it to I'm not talking about us at all. There's a lot of good companies out there, like indies, you know, friends of mine that have, like, they work really hard and they are really ready to give it their all, and then, you know, you invest something like Meta loses billions upon billions of dollars on a complete delusion. Right, and with metaverse and all of these buzzwords that mean nothing, and then the core concept and even the result, no one wants it. You know, Meta had to force their own employees to go on Horizon so that the numbers would be a little bit higher. It's sad. And so what are we doing here? Right? Why are we wasting so much time? Why are we wasting so many resources when we could be doing something as a whole? It's your money. You can do with it whatever you want, of course. But if you really are sitting there and trying to convince me that you're trying to progress the scene or progress the technology and make a better future for humanity as a whole, well, that ain't it, chief, as they say.
There's an interesting thing that I thought of. We mentioned business, and we mentioned creative art and the gamers, etc., etc. How do you manage the balance between creative side and the business side of running a company?
Well, depends on the project, I suppose, and depends. Some projects require.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you really invested in a business project, or you're more like, I'll handle this. Let me get this job done, etc., etc.
Well, I'm definitely a realist and a developer at heart. Certainly, I prefer the part where you make games, not where you handle the business. But it has to be done because this is the reality of things. If you can have the most passionate project in the world, but if the framework doesn't support you, if the pillars are crumbling, if you don't have a proper monetization, if you don't have a user acquisition model, if you don't have a go-to-market, if you don't have those concepts, if you haven't done your market research, you have to do the work and you have to go on EDA and Superdata and Sensor Tower and DigiCap, and you have to actually sift through the research paper and prove at the very least to yourself that you can make decisions based on that. And then sometimes you obviously have to prove it to venture capitalists, to someone who's investing, to be like, I do believe that I can reach this and this amount of CCUs because look at those current trends, right? And I have a similar product, but I have a USP that I can bring to the table. We leverage this in this technology, or we have this in this IP, or we have, these people, which can also be a brand. If you bring someone like Chris Metzen, you're buying a certain brand as well, right? If, Elon Musk comes and plays your game, well, that's also a certain, it's value in some sense or another. And, that's part of business as well. So, but ideally, of course, I try to focus more on the creation side. But if the business side collapses, then everything collapses, and it doesn't really matter how passionate you are. You can't, buy, pay your rent with exposure. Right? So that it really depends that you find. And sometimes, we had deals in the UGC front that we've done of WorldSmith, that we just did just to pay the bills. Really, you look at the company coffers, and you're like, well, time to fill up the coffers, I suppose, with this project. I'm not really hyped about it, but we can do it, and it really depends. But I think you can really feel the authenticity, because there's a lot of people certainly that are salesmen. This is something that with Montenegro I didn't necessarily enjoy so far, is that not the country itself, but like the events we had. You have these events, and people come from all over the world, or they come within the country. And they don't really care about the country. I'm sorry, but it is what it is. They don't really care what happens. They are here to spread their market, I suppose, see, scout, do reconnaissance. Then they leave next morning or in 3 days, and they forget about it, and they go to the next country. It's the truth, and it's like, but let's not pretend, right? Let's not play any games. You're here to sell something. You're here to sell your product. You're here to sell your organization, yourself. If you are a newcomer, that I've seen that as well. People just wanting to be a speaker somewhere for what? So that you can go to your LinkedIn and then say, oh, I'm a speaker. Add another title to it. Or put it on your Instagram. And it's disingenuous. And I can't be bothered to deal with that. But it is the reality of things, I suppose. And it's nothing, like, I'm not going to say that and things will change magically, right? You still need a certain critical mass. And this is something when I spoke with rather large venture capital, well, one of the biggest venture capital firms in gaming. People can look it up, I suppose, without me naming it. They definitely look at the Balkans. I think that was one of your questions as well, in terms of the Balkans, in terms of Crna Gora.
Yes.
Where do we see the future? Obviously, they look at future markets. They look at Africa, they look at South America, and they look at the Balkans. It is not a question when, it is, rather, it is not a question if, it is rather a question when. Sooner or later, it will happen, that we will reach a critical mass. But right now, when I spoke with 2 venture capital firms, and I say, hey, look, the Balkans, they are kind of developing. We have here and there, Serbia had an interesting game. Maybe you've heard of it as one of those gory indie games a while ago. And, Croatia always had Crow Team, technically. It's a bit quieter now. They also have Ironwood and such, and other companies that are trying to do something. And this critical mass coming with the new generation is increasing, right? Certainly. But that mass has not been reached yet where I can come to an investor because I tried to be like, hey, look, just give us $2-3 million, right? We establish something here, and depending on the evaluation, we can. But they can say that we can't do an evaluation because there's nothing there, right? And that's why I actually bother to come to podcasts and to speak at certain events or mentor people so that we do get that critical mass, that there's something developing, that's a grassroots organization that is going to, where people will look at it and they say, okay, there's something here, we're developing it, and there is a certain safety, let's say, to actually, when you want to be a game developer, to stay here and develop something. And seeing the reality, instead of going to Austria or Germany and leave your family, leave your traditions and culture behind and be like, well, it's so much better there. Well, is it?
Not really.
Yeah, is it really? It's just like people telling me how amazing it is in Germany when I lived there for 21 years. It's like, well, have you just been there as a tourist, or why do you think? Do you know the basics? Let us sit down and I'll ask you some basic questions. I'll ask you about GZ. I ask you about crime rate. I ask you about migration, and tell me anything about it. Can you cite anything? No, you can't. Oh, really? And then at the same time, you're telling me how great it is there and how bad Montenegro is, and I can't subscribe to that. I can't take that seriously because it's like, well, you don't know what you have until you lose it, I suppose.
Of course.
So
you mentioned a lot of work you did with various different companies. What is the one you're like the highlight of your life? What's the career that you're proud of? The project that you're proud of? If you can pick one.
Oh, I don't think I can, but let me try.
Pick 3.
Okay, yeah, that's much easier. Well, definitely one of them would be StarCraft 2, because that aged really well. Yes, I know it obviously the interest went down over time, but I don't think there was necessarily major mistakes that were made. Yes, you can argue about the Legacy of the Void and the campaign and what they've done with the characters. It's a different story, but the gameplay itself, right, the esports itself, I think that one I'm fairly proud of have been part of that. To have been, still stay in touch with some of the people. That was definitely a thing that I can say. It aged well, and I've really enjoyed working on that. So that was great.
So that's one.
That's definitely one. Yes, I do think my brief work, but still very impactful work on Metro Exodus. I like that one. I like the 4A guys. I like, for me. Their CEO is really an inspiration. If you actually know the story, but it's a long story, but we don't have time for that. But he is really one of the rare people who actually cares a lot about his employees, and that's a rarity. Like someone who's not going, oh guys, we made it. Metro 23 or Redux or whatever, it has sold really well. Let me just get another Lamborghini or something and make it a house. No, he really cared, and he really made it. He put all of that money, most of the money, to his employees. Be like, guys, you really believed in me, and you really worked in the garage with generators, like an abandoned warehouse where they started working. And it sounds like a sob story, but it's true. It is true. They did actually work in pretty harsh conditions. They worked a long time, and it worked.
I'm sorry, are they Ukrainian or?
Yes. They do have. They do have external studios as well. They had one in Malta, if I remember correctly, when we worked with Metro Exodus. It's been 7 years or so, but yeah, they definitely still Ukraine first and foremost. And it's not political. This was way before.
I know.
It's non-political. It's really.
It's like 93 Metro One.
No. That was much later. That was still in the 2000s. Actually.
It was the first Metro like Metro 233?
2033, yes, yeah. Based on the books, right?
Yeah,
and he really has done a lot of work to pay his employees back, right? He could have just fired them and just gotten other people, and he's rich, he can do whatever he wants, but he didn't. And really, when you stand for something, you will never fall, or falter. When you stand for nothing, you will fall for anything. So. For me, that principal stance that he had, that was really, really interesting. That was an interesting kind of environment with him. So, yeah, and other than that...
That's 2?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would pick another third favorite child. They're all kind of, some less, some more, of course. But those are really important projects of mine that kind of left a mark, let's say, because we worked on Warcraft Reforged and we bailed several months before they shipped it because we saw that it's really just collapsing downwards, right? And that's not something we really were interested in. And other than that, I just like to work on my own projects where we have full freedom and we can experiment with really unique things. And unique doesn't mean good. The players will be the judge of that. If maybe I have it all wrong, who knows? But I don't think so, and our testers don't think so, our developers don't think so. So we'll see, because I want to actually innovate a lot. I want to bring something interesting to the table. I want to make esports with this particular title. I want to make it interactive, in the most literal sense. That you can vote on certain events in game. That you can your input really fosters and impacts the development long term.
It matters.
The world, the world itself, the world of this IP, this franchise, right, is really shifted to a much more engaging degree, but not for KPIs and metrics and such, but rather for something that people really enjoy. Because I can definitely see that people are so sick and tired of AAA and them constantly screwing players over and not caring about them. But there's enough people who don't care about that, enough gamers who don't care, but they will still buy the most recent FIFA. They don't care about that. They don't care that that they try to have a tabula rasa and start from scratch again. That your loot box, your Messi and whether it's still Zidane, I haven't kept up with it. Your Beckham, and then at some point it's all gone, and you have a buggier version maybe next year. But at least the loot boxes are back on the menu. There's enough people who don't care because they're very, very, very casual players, and they don't follow industry. They don't really care about that. They don't care if there's some unethical practices going on and such. Same with Call of Duty. I've been one of the discussions we had about Montenegro as a whole, and I remember when I was working on one presentation, I was looking at the BDP of Crna Gora in 2021. If I remember correctly, it was 4.1 billion, and then in 2021 it was 4.9, right? And 2020 it was 4.1, and then you compare that to the same year for Fortnite or Call of Duty, and Fortnite had 5.8 billion of that same year. So that game alone has outperformed. Right now, I understand, of course, yes, Montenegro is a small country, of course.
But it's just a game.
But it is also just a game. It's just one game. Now imagine we had one game that is founded here in Montenegro, and it is only, let's say, a tenth, which is still a lot, of course. But it's some popular IP that's only a tenth of that. Imagine how that would actually affect the BDP, right? So if people, whether from the government or here the Ministry of Education, not education, both education and entertainment, if they look at it and they see just the numbers, they might not quite understand what this all is about, but they can see numbers, they can see success, and even people, assuming taxpayer money will be properly handled, let's say.
Of course.
But I want to be a little bit more optimistic, right? And assuming that is properly handled, of course, you can definitely see how very impactful that production could be on the entirety of Montenegro. That hopefully the quality of life will increase. Now I understand, I'm sure some Montenegrin locals, they'll be thinking, oh, that guy is a bit naive. He thinks that the government will do something good for us. So it's like, well, it depends. It's also the ball is also in your court. You really have to see what exactly what I like about Montenegro is that it's so small, and that I do think, from my limited experience so far and from understanding the politics, that change can happen. You know more about politics here domestically than me, of course, but I do think because of the size, I do think there's definitely room for good, and if gaming can contribute to that,
that's even better.
Yeah, for sure. Like I do know when we were at the EGS, and he was saying something like, "Oh, Bar could be like a Katowice in 5 years or something, or 10 years, right?" That would be very useful, I think. Well, I don't know if everyone would like that, but I do think that.
But I think
it would be a net it could be a net positive, nonetheless, for the country as a whole. Definitely for the municipality. I hope so, at least. So.
But it's quite invested in esports as of.
I think so. Yeah.
As of 2 years ago, I think a year ago, it's quite invested in all the events it's doing. There's no other town than Podgorica and Bar to do esports events and festivals, etc., etc. So I think Bar, with the proper guidance and money, of course, they can be Katowice. Why not?
More or less. It can be following their footsteps at least.
At least following their
Yes.
footsteps, yeah. We are kind of running out of time.
Yeah, of course.
But I have one last question, and that's to give us the message to the audience and the potential collaborators. What is the message?
Well, I suppose the message is a preview of what it's like to collaborate with me, which is this podcast, I suppose. And I think you have listened to the podcast, and either you think I'm authentic or you think I'm not. Simple as that. And I think authenticity is a very important thing, integrity. Whether it's a suit sitting here trying to sell you something, or whether it's someone who maybe does want things to get better. There's nothing wrong with the two things being true at the same time, as long as they're balanced, of course. You know, so I do really much hope, because I want to stay here as long as I can, for the foreseeable future, hopefully longer than that. So of course, it would be really very interesting for me if it does work out and we move forward. And yeah.
We have like a lot of questions we didn't cover, and I have a lot of ideas that I want to share with you, but unfortunately we don't have we don't have time this time, so maybe sometimes next time. I want to thank you again for being my guest and for sharing your career with us, with all of us, and it's pretty amazing, to be honest, because I'm kind of gaming nerd, as you can see.
I can.
And everybody that is watching is kind of nerdish in that kind of way. So we mentioning all the games we love. Like, I have to give the primer to StarCraft, Warcraft, and Dota, and Valve, and Epic Games. Besides all the other projects you did, and Metro, of course. But those are the games that we grew up on. Yeah. So we all love, and we're all hearing about inside information that you have. So I want to thank you again for being here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Lastly, as I said, if anyone wants to just get in touch, just talk. Don't collaborate. I suppose you can contact me on Telegram, which is WS_studio, and feel free to chat. I do like to, mentor people as well when I can, when the time is there, or just talk to locals. It's very interesting, and they can teach me a lot as well. So.
Ok, dame i gospodo, to je sve za večeras. Vidimo se sljedeće nedjelje. Laku noć.